The stagecoach rattled into Randsburg, California on a blistering August afternoon in 1887, and Grace Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, wondering if she had made the greatest mistake of her life. The mining town sprawled across the harsh Mojave desert landscape like scattered dice, its wooden buildings bleached pale by the relentless sun. She had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she had never met, exchanging letters with someone named Martin Vance, who promised her a new life far from the suffocating expectations of her widowed mother and the gossip that had followed her family since her father's scandalous bankruptcy and subsequent death. Grace was 22 years old, educated beyond what most considered necessary for a woman, and desperate enough to answer an advertisement in the matrimonial section of a newspaper that had somehow found its way into her hands during a particularly bleak November evening. The driver called out their arrival, and Grace gathered her small carpetbag, smoothing down the traveling dress that had once been a deep burgundy but now looked faded and dusty. Her trunk would be unloaded separately, containing everything she owned in the world, which was precious little. As she stepped down from the coach, the heat struck her like a physical blow, so different from the humid summers back east that she momentarily lost her breath. The main street was unpaved, lined with establishments that promised supplies, liquor, and various other services she tried not to think about too carefully. Men in dusty work clothes moved about their business, and she caught more than one curious stare directed her way. A young woman in a simple calico dress approached with a warm smile. "You must be Miss Whitmore. I'm Alina Patterson. My husband runs the general store. Mr. Vance asked me to meet you and bring you to the boarding house where you can freshen up. He'll call on you this evening if that suits you." Grace felt relief wash through her. "Thank you, yes, that would be wonderful. The journey was quite long." Alina took her arm companionably as they walked down the street, chattering about the town and its inhabitants. Randsburg had sprung up in the early 1880s when gold and silver were discovered in the nearby mountains, and while it had not grown into one of the larger mining towns, it sustained a steady population of miners, merchants, and the various people who made their living serving both groups. The boarding house was a two-story structure that looked relatively well-maintained, run by a widow named Mrs. Harriet Chen, whose Chinese father and American mother had given her a unique perspective and a reputation for fairness in a town that did not always extend such courtesies. Mrs. Chen showed Grace to a small but clean room on the second floor, and a boy brought up her trunk shortly after. Grace unpacked her few belongings, hanging the two dresses that were not hopelessly wrinkled, and found the wash basin and pitcher a blessed relief. She scrubbed away the layers of dust and grime from the journey, changed into her better dress of deep green cotton, and tried to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. What would Martin Vance be like in person? His letters had been articulate and thoughtful, describing his work as a ranch hand on one of the larger cattle operations outside town, his modest savings, and his desire for a wife to build a life with. He had been honest about the harsh conditions and the hard work, never painting a false picture of ease and comfort. Grace appreciated that honesty, even as it frightened her. She had not been entirely honest with him in return. Her letters had mentioned her father's death, but not the circumstances, not the debts he had left behind, not the way her mother had turned bitter and cold in the aftermath. Grace had not written about the nightmares that had plagued her since finding her father in his study that terrible morning, the pistol still in his hand, and the account book spread across his desk, like evidence of his failure. She had not mentioned how she sometimes woke gasping and crying, convinced she could smell gunpowder and blood, or how the darkness brought visions of death and loss that made sleep a torment to be endured rather than a rest to be embraced. That evening, as the brutal heat finally began to ease with the setting sun, Eleanor Patterson arrived to escort her downstairs where Martin Vance waited in the boarding house parlor. Grace's hands trembled as she descended the stairs, and then she saw him standing by the window, hat in his hands, looking as nervous as she felt. He was tall and lean, perhaps 27 or 28 years old, with sun-darkened skin and brown hair that wanted to curl despite being slicked back with water. His face was weathered but honest, with clear gray eyes that met hers directly as he took a step forward. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had imagined, roughened by dust and wind. "It's a real pleasure to finally meet you in person. I hope your journey was not too difficult." "Mr. Vance," Grace replied, managing a small curtsy despite her travel fatigue. "Thank you for your kind welcome. The journey was long but bearable, and everyone here has been most gracious." They sat together in the parlor with Mrs. Chen serving as chaperone, though she busied herself with needlework in the corner and gave them what privacy was proper. Martin spoke about his work at the Copper Ridge Ranch, how he had been saving money for 3 years to build a small house on a piece of land he had purchased about 5 miles from town. The house was nearly finished, he explained, just waiting for a few final touches. He had furniture, basic as it was, and a good horse, chickens for eggs, and hopes of starting a small herd of cattle of his own while continuing his work at the ranch. Grace listened and answered questions about her own background, carefully editing as she went. She spoke of Boston, of her education at a young ladies' academy, of her love of reading and her skill with accounts, which made Martin's eyes light up with interest. He admitted he was better with cattle than numbers and had worried about managing the financial aspects of his future ranch. They talked until the light faded completely, and Mrs. Chen began lighting lamps. And when Martin finally took his leave, he asked permission to call on her again the next day. "I know we agreed in our letters to marry soon after your arrival," he said, standing at the door with his hat back on his head. "But I want you to be certain, Miss Whitmore. I want you to feel comfortable with this decision. Take a few days to settle in and see if Randsburg, and if I meet with your expectations." Grace felt something warm bloom in her chest at his consideration. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. I will look forward to your next visit." Over the following days, Martin called on Grace every evening after finishing his work at the ranch. He showed her around Randsburg, introducing her to the various shopkeepers and families, making sure she understood what kind of community she would be joining. The town had a church that shared a circuit preacher with several other small settlements, a school that operated when they could find a teacher, and a surprising number of respectable families, alongside the rougher elements that came with any mining town. Grace met Eleanor's husband Thomas at the general store, a kind man who immediately offered Grace credit if she needed anything before the wedding. She met the doctor, an older gentleman named Samuel Hart, who had come west after losing his wife to cholera, seeking a place where his grief would not be reflected in every familiar face. She even met Martin's employer, a gruff but fair man named Jacob Morrison, who owned the Copper Ridge Ranch and spoke highly of Martin's character and work ethic. On the 4th evening of her residence in Randsburg, as they walked along the edge of town where the buildings gave way to desert scrub, and the last light painted the mountains purple and gold, Martin stopped and turned to face her directly. "Grace," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I've come to care for you beyond what I expected from our letters. You are intelligent and kind, and I see strength in you even when you try to hide it." I would be honored if you would consent to marry me this Sunday after the preacher holds services. But I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything you need to tell me before we take this step? Anything that weighs on your heart?" Grace's throat tightened, and for a moment she considered telling him everything, spilling out all the darkness and fear she carried. But shame held her tongue, shame and the terror that he would reject her, would see her as damaged and unsuitable. So instead she smiled and took his offered hand. "I consent to marry you, Martin. This Sunday would be perfect, and there is nothing that should prevent our happiness together." It was a lie, and she knew it even as the words left her lips, but she was too afraid of losing this chance at a new beginning to speak the truth. The wedding took place in the small church on Sunday afternoon, with Alina Patterson and her husband serving as witnesses, Mrs. Chen attending with a beautiful embroidered handkerchief as a gift, and a surprising number of townspeople filling the pews to witness the union of their well-liked neighbor and the pretty Eastern girl who had come so far to marry him. Grace wore a dress that Alina had helped her alter, a pale blue silk that had belonged to her trousseau before her father's death, and Martin wore a new shirt and his best pants, his hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaved. The circuit preacher, a Methodist minister named Reverend Walsh, performed the ceremony with warmth and humor, speaking about the challenges and joys of building a life together in this harsh but beautiful land. When Martin kissed her as his wife, Grace felt hope flutter in her chest like a captive bird seeking freedom. Perhaps marriage would cure her nightmares. Perhaps having someone beside her in the darkness would finally bring the peace she so desperately sought. Perhaps love would be enough to erase the memories that haunted her. Martin had rented a small house in town for their first week of marriage, wanting to give Grace time to adjust before moving her out to the more isolated property where he was building their permanent home. He carried her over the threshold with surprising ease despite his lean build, and Grace laughed, feeling young and light for the first time in years. The house had only 3 rooms, but it was clean and private, and Martin had clearly made an effort, with wildflowers in a jar on the table, and the bed made up with new linens that must have cost him dearly. They were both nervous that first night, fumbling through the intimacies of marriage with more sweetness than skill. Martin was gentle and patient, and though Grace felt awkward and uncertain, there was also a tenderness between them that made her believe they would find their way together. Afterward, as they lay in the darkness with Martin's arm around her shoulders, Grace felt herself beginning to relax into sleep, tired from the emotion of the day and the newness of everything. But the nightmares came anyway, just as they always did. Grace found herself back in her father's study in Boston, the morning light streaming through the windows but somehow wrong, too red, too thick, like light filtered through blood. She woke with a gasping cry, jerking upright in bed, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might tear from her chest. Her nightgown was soaked with sweat despite the cooling night air, and she was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to remember where she was when she was, who she was now as opposed to who she had been then. "Grace, Grace, what is it? What is wrong?" Martin's voice cut through the panic, and his hands were on her shoulders, steady and warm and real. She turned toward him blindly, still half caught in the nightmare, and saw concern etched clearly on his face in the moonlight that filtered through the window. "I am sorry," she gasped, trying to control her breathing, trying to stop the tears. "I am so sorry, I did not mean to wake you." "Never mind that," Martin said firmly. He shifted to sit up fully beside her, keeping one hand on her back, rubbing slow circles that gradually helped her breathing steady. "What happened? Did something frighten you?" Grace wrapped her arms around herself, humiliation burning through her alongside the fading terror. On her wedding night, she had already proven herself to be a burden, a broken thing not worth the care Martin had shown her. "It was just a bad dream," she whispered. "It will pass. Please go back to sleep. I will be fine." "You are not fine," Martin said quietly. "You are shaking like a leaf in a storm, and you cried out like someone was hurting you. Grace, talk to me. Let me help." "You cannot help," Grace said, and the bitterness in her own voice shocked her. "No one can help. It is just something I must endure." "How long?" Martin asked. "How long have you been having nightmares like this?" Grace closed her eyes, debating whether to lie again or to finally speak the truth she had been hiding. The darkness seemed to press in around her, and she was so tired of carrying everything alone, so exhausted from pretending to be strong when she felt like she was crumbling from the inside out. "Since my father died," she finally whispered. "Nearly 3 years now. They come almost every night. Sometimes worse than others, but they always come." Martin was quiet for a long moment, his hand still moving in those slow, soothing circles on her back. Then he spoke, his voice still low and calm. "How did your father die, Grace? In your letters, you only said that he had passed." "He killed himself," Grace said, and the words felt like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples through everything. "He had made bad investments, lost nearly everything. There were debts he could not pay, and the shame of it overwhelmed him. I found him in his study one morning. There was a gun and blood, and his account book spread across the desk like a confession of failure. My mother blamed me for not noticing how troubled he was, for not doing something to prevent it. She said a good daughter would have seen the signs, would have saved him, and she was right. I should have noticed. I should have helped him. Instead, I was selfish, thinking about my own concerns, and he died alone in his despair." As she spoke, the tears came harder, years of guilt and grief pouring out in the darkness of this small house in a town she barely knew, confessed to a man she had married only hours before. She expected Martin to pull away, to regret his choice, to see her now as the damaged burden she truly was. Instead, he drew her against his chest, wrapping both arms around her and holding her close. "Grace," he said into her hair, his voice rough with emotion, "what happened to your father was not your fault. A man's decision to take his own life comes from a pain so deep that nothing external can prevent it. You were his daughter, not his keeper, not his savior. The blame your mother placed on you was wrong, born of her own grief and anger, but wrong nonetheless." "But I should have seen," Grace sobbed against his chest. "I should have done something. You were what? 19 years old, 20, still practically a child yourself." Martin tightened his hold on her. "Grace, I cannot imagine the burden you have been carrying, thinking yourself responsible for something you could not have controlled or prevented. And to suffer nightmares for 3 years without anyone to comfort you or tell you it was not your fault. How did you bear it?" "I had no choice but to bear it," Grace said. "My mother would not speak of it, and our friends abandoned us after the scandal. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. So I endured, and I thought perhaps if I came out here, if I started fresh, the nightmares would stop. But they have not stopped. They follow me like a shadow I cannot escape." Martin shifted them both so that he was leaning back against the headboard with Grace cradled against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. The position was comfortable and secure, and slowly Grace felt her shaking begin to subside. "Tell me about the nightmares," Martin said. "What do you see when they come?" Grace hesitated, but there seemed little point in hiding anything now. So she described the terrible visions that plagued her sleep, the way her father's death replayed in her mind with horrible variations, the accusations she imagined, the blood and guilt that colored everything. She talked until her voice grew hoarse, purging the poison that had festered inside her for so long. And Martin listened without interruption, his hand stroking her hair in a gesture so tender it made her want to weep anew. When she finally fell silent, exhausted from confession and tears, Martin spoke again. "My older brother died when I was 16, he said quietly. He was working on our family farm back in Missouri, and a plow horse spooked and kicked him in the head. He died 3 days later without ever waking up. For months afterward, I had nightmares about it, about finding him in the field, about watching him die over and over again. My mother would hear me cry out, and she would come sit with me until I fell back asleep. She said that nightmares were how the mind tried to make sense of things too terrible to fully understand, that they would ease with time but needed to be acknowledged rather than hidden away in shame." Grace turned her face up toward him. "Did they ease? Did the nightmares stop?" "Eventually," Martin said. "Not all at once, but gradually they came less often and with less power. But I think they eased faster because I had someone to talk to about them. Someone who held me when I was afraid and reminded me that I was not alone in my grief." "I have been alone for so long," Grace whispered. "Even when my mother was in the same house, I was alone with it." "You are not alone anymore," Martin said firmly. "You are my wife, Grace, and that means your burdens are now mine to help carry. I cannot erase what happened to your father or take away your nightmares with a word, but I can promise you this. When the darkness comes, I will be here. When the nightmares drag you down, I will hold you. You will never again have to face them by yourself." Grace felt something crack open inside her chest, some hard shell she had built around her heart to survive the loneliness and shame. "I am sorry I did not tell you before. I was afraid you would not want to marry me if you knew how broken I am." "You are not broken," Martin said, and there was almost anger in his voice now, though not directed at her. "You are wounded, Grace, and there is a difference. Broken things cannot be mended, but wounds can heal with proper care and time. And I meant every word of the vows I spoke today. For better or worse, in sickness and in health. That includes wounds of the mind and heart, not just the body." They sat together in the darkness for a long time, neither speaking, just holding each other while the night deepened around them. Grace felt wrung out but also lighter somehow, as though the confession had released some of the pressure that had been building inside her for years. When Martin finally suggested they try to sleep again, Grace felt fear flutter through her. "What if the nightmare comes back?" she asked. "Then I will be here when you wake," Martin said simply. He settled them back down in the bed, keeping her close against his side with his arm around her. "Rest now, Grace. I have got you." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the steady rise and fall of Martin's chest beneath her cheek, the solid warmth of his body beside her, the security of his arms around her. For the first time in 3 years, she did not feel alone in the darkness. And while fear still lingered at the edges of her consciousness, it was tempered now by something else, something that felt almost like hope. She slept, and if dreams came, they were gentle ones, not the nightmares that usually haunted her rest. Over the following days, Grace and Martin settled into the rhythms of marriage. Martin continued his work at the Copper Ridge Ranch while Grace began making their temporary home more comfortable and learning the ways of Randsburg. Eleanor Patterson became a true friend, teaching Grace how to shop in the general store where supplies were sometimes scarce and always expensive, showing her which miners' wives were friendly and which were best avoided, and sharing gossip that was sometimes scandalous but always entertaining. The nightmares continued, though. Some nights Grace slept peacefully, but more often she woke gasping and crying, dragged from sleep by visions of death and guilt. Each time, Martin woke with her, holding her and talking to her until the terror passed. He never complained, never showed impatience or frustration with her broken sleep. Instead, he developed a routine, keeping a lamp within easy reach so he could bring light to chase away the darkness, keeping water by the bedside so Grace could drink and wash her face, and keeping his arms ready to provide shelter and comfort. One night, about 2 weeks into their marriage, Grace woke from a particularly brutal nightmare, this one involving not just her father but also her mother, who in the dream blamed Grace for both deaths, though her mother was still alive back in Boston as far as Grace knew. She came awake sobbing uncontrollably, and Martin immediately pulled her into his arms. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "You are safe. You are here with me in Randsburg. It was just a dream, Grace, just a dream." But this time the terror would not ease. Grace could not stop crying, could not catch her breath properly, felt like she was drowning in guilt and fear. Martin lit the lamp and then lifted her bodily from the bed, carrying her to the small sitting room where he settled into a chair with her in his lap like a child. He wrapped a blanket around both of them and just held her, rocking slightly, murmuring reassurances that eventually penetrated the panic. "Talk to me," he said when her breathing had steadied somewhat. "Tell me what you saw." Grace described the nightmare, and as she spoke, Martin listened with his full attention, asking occasional questions that forced her to think more clearly about the images rather than just reacting to the emotions they provoked. It was a technique his mother had used with him, he explained, helping the dreaming mind separate from the waking mind so the terror lost some of its power. "Your mother is alive, correct?" Martin asked. "Back in Boston, as far as I know," Grace said. "We have not corresponded since I left. She was angry that I was answering a mail-order bride advertisement. She said it proved I was selfish and shameful, willing to abandon her in her time of need to chase after a man I did not even know." "Did she need you there?" Martin asked. "Or did she just want you to remain so she could continue to blame you for your father's death?" Grace went still, never having considered the question in quite those terms before. "I do not know," she admitted. "She had enough money to live on from a small inheritance from her own mother. She was not destitute, but she was alone." "Being alone and needing someone are not the same thing," Martin said quietly. "Grace, from what you have told me, your mother used you as a target for her own grief and rage. That is understandable, perhaps, in the immediate aftermath of tragedy, but for 3 years. That is not grief anymore. That is cruelty." Grace felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different. Not panic, but a kind of painful relief at hearing someone name what she had not allowed herself to acknowledge. "She was my mother. I owed her respect and care." "You owed her what any child owes a parent," Martin agreed. "But a parent also owes their child protection and love, not blame for things beyond their control. You did nothing wrong by coming here, Grace. You chose survival and hope over slow poisoning by guilt that was never rightfully yours to bear." They talked through the rest of the night, Martin asking questions and Grace answering them, examining memories and beliefs she had never questioned before. As the sky began to lighten toward dawn, Grace realized she felt different somehow, as though some weight had shifted if not entirely lifted. She was still tired, still afraid the nightmares would continue, but she no longer felt quite so alone in facing them. "The sun is coming up," Martin said, nodding toward the window where the darkness was giving way to the gray-blue of early morning. "We made it through another night and you are still here, still safe. The nightmares cannot actually hurt you, Grace. They are terrible and frightening, but they cannot change the truth of where you are now or who you are becoming." Grace looked out at the growing light and felt something settle in her chest. Dawn had always seemed to bring a kind of peace, a breaking of the darkness that ruled the night. Perhaps that was true not just of the sky but of the soul as well. "Thank you," she whispered to Martin, turning her face to kiss his jaw since she could not quite reach his lips from her position in his lap. "Thank you for staying with me through the darkness." "Always," Martin promised. "For as many nights as it takes, for as many dawns as we must see together, I will stay with you." The following week, Martin took Grace out to see the property where he had been building their permanent home. They rode together on his sturdy bay gelding, Grace sitting sideways in front of Martin with his arms around her holding the reins. The 5 miles from town took them deeper into the desert landscape, following a rough track that wound between rocky outcrops and scattered Joshua trees. The morning was already hot, and Grace was grateful for the wide-brimmed bonnet Eleanor had insisted she needed for life in the Mojave. The property sat in a small valley between 2 ridges of rocky hills, with a seasonal creek bed that Martin explained carried water during the winter rains and occasional flash floods. He had chosen the site carefully, with access to a spring that provided year-round water, enough flat land for a house and outbuildings, and grazing for the cattle he hoped to accumulate over the coming years. The house itself was a simple structure of wood and adobe, one large room that could be divided later if needed, with a covered porch across the front, and a sturdy roof that would keep out the worst of the desert sun and the winter cold. "It is not much yet," Martin said as he helped Grace down from the horse, his voice uncertain. "But it is sound and it is ours, free and clear. I thought we could add on as we need to, maybe build a separate bedroom and a kitchen as money allows. What do you think?" Grace walked around the property, examining the house and the land with eyes trained by growing up in a merchant household to assess value and potential. The house was indeed simple, but it was well built, the work of someone who understood carpentry and took pride in doing things properly. The porch would provide much-needed shade, and she could already imagine a chair there where she might sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The spring was a genuine treasure in this arid landscape, burbling up from between rocks to form a small pool before trickling away into the creek bed. There was a garden plot already marked out near the spring, and Martin had built a chicken coop that currently stood empty but would soon house the laying hens he planned to purchase. "I think it is wonderful," Grace said honestly, turning to smile at him. "I think we can build a good life here, Martin. It will be hard work, but it will be ours." Martin's whole face lit up with relief and pleasure. "You truly like it. You are not disappointed." "I left Boston seeking a new beginning," Grace said, walking back to take his hands in hers. "This looks like exactly that. A place where we can build something together, where the past does not have to define us. I am not disappointed, Martin. I am grateful." They spent the day working on the property together, Martin showing Grace what still needed to be done before they could move in permanently, discussing plans and dreams for the future. Grace felt a contentment she had not experienced in years, physical labor combining with purpose and hope to create something almost like happiness. When they finally rode back to town as the sun was setting, she was exhausted but in a good way, tired from honest work rather than from fighting nightmares. That night, Grace slept deeply and peacefully, without dreams of any kind, and woke to morning light feeling rested for the first time in what seemed like forever. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Some nights brought nightmares and Grace would wake crying, but Martin was always there to hold her through them, talking her down from the panic and staying with her until she could sleep again. Other nights passed peacefully, and Grace began to notice that the peaceful nights were becoming more frequent. She also noticed that the nightmares themselves seemed to be changing, losing some of their sharp terror and becoming more like regular dreams, still unpleasant but not paralyzing. Martin and Grace moved to their property in late September, when the brutal summer heat finally began to ease. Grace threw herself into making their house a home, using her skill with numbers to help Martin plan their finances and her education to order supplies from catalogs that came through the general store. She started a garden near the spring, planting vegetables that Alina assured her would grow in the desert climate if given enough water and care. Martin bought 6 laying hens and a rooster, and Grace found she enjoyed caring for the chickens and collecting eggs each morning. Life fell into a rhythm shaped by the seasons and the work. Martin rode out to the Copper Ridge Ranch for days a week, putting in long hours with the cattle and earning the wages that kept them afloat while building their own small herd. Grace managed their home, cooked their meals, tended her garden, and slowly transformed the simple house into a comfortable living space. They went into Randsburg every Sunday for church services, where Grace had been welcomed into the small community of women who supported each other through the challenges of desert life. On a cool October evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Martin took Grace's hand and spoke thoughtfully. "You have not had a nightmare in almost a week," he observed. "I have been keeping track, hoping I was not just imagining that they were coming less often." Grace nodded, having noticed the same thing herself. "I think talking about them helps," she said, "and knowing you will be there when they come makes them less frightening somehow." The anticipation used to be almost as bad as the nightmares themselves, lying awake afraid to sleep because I knew what was waiting. But now, even when they come, I know I will not have to face them alone. "You will never have to face anything alone again," Martin said firmly. He was quiet for a moment, then continued, "Grace, I need to tell you something, and I do not want you to feel pressured or obligated in any way. But I think honesty between us has proven valuable, so I will speak plainly. I love you. I did not expect to fall in love so quickly. Thought perhaps affection and partnership would be enough, but you have become dear to me in ways I did not anticipate. Your strength and your vulnerability both, your intelligence and your kindness, the way you have worked so hard to build this life with me despite carrying such heavy burdens. I love you, Grace, and I want you to know that, even if you are not ready to say it back to me." Grace felt her eyes fill with tears, but these were good tears, born of emotion too large to contain. She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I did not think I could love anyone, thought that part of me had died with my father or been killed by the years of guilt and nightmares. But you have been so patient and so kind, Martin. You have held me through the darkness and shown me that dawn always comes. You have given me safety and comfort and the space to begin healing. How could I not love you?" Martin pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. They held each other as the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, and Grace felt something she had not dared to feel for 3 long years. She felt like she might actually have a future worth living. Winter came to the Mojave Desert with surprising cold, the nights dropping to freezing temperatures even as the days remained mild. Grace and Martin worked together to prepare for the season, Martin hunting rabbits and the occasional deer to supplement their supplies while Grace preserved vegetables from her garden and learned to bake bread in the small cast iron stove that heated their house. They purchased 2 pregnant cows from Jacob Morrison at a fair price, the beginning of their own herd, and Martin built a small barn and corral to shelter the animals. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they had lost much of their power. Grace no longer woke screaming, instead waking with tears or trembling that Martin could soothe with relative ease. The content of the dreams was changing too. Instead of seeing her father's death over and over, Grace began dreaming of conversations with him, sometimes arguments about his choices, sometimes reconciliations where he apologized for leaving her to face the aftermath of his decision. She told Martin about these dreams, and he suggested that perhaps her mind was working through her grief in new ways, finding paths toward acceptance rather than remaining trapped in trauma. One cold January night, Grace woke from a dream that left her crying but not from fear. In the dream, her father had been alive and whole, standing in a field of wildflowers like those that would bloom in the desert come spring. He had looked at her with love and told her he was proud of the woman she had become, that his death had never been her fault, that he had been lost in darkness that had nothing to do with her light. He had told her to live, to love, to build a good life, and not let his final choice poison her chance at happiness. Martin woke when he felt Grace crying and immediately reached for her, but she turned into his embrace with a small, watery laugh. "It was not a bad dream," she explained, wiping at her tears. "Or rather, it was sad but not terrible. I think maybe my father was saying goodbye, giving me permission to stop carrying guilt that was never mine to bear." Martin held her close, his hand stroking through her loose hair. "Do you believe that it was not your fault?" Grace thought carefully before answering. "I am beginning to," she said slowly. "I do not think I am all the way there yet, but I am closer than I was. You have helped me see things differently, Martin. You and this place and the life we are building. I am not the same woman who arrived in Randsburg terrified and alone last August. I am becoming someone new, someone stronger." "You were always strong," Martin corrected gently. "You just needed someone to remind you of that strength." They talked through the rest of the night, as had become their custom when dreams disturbed Grace's sleep. But this time, the conversation was different, less about soothing panic and more about exploring possibilities. Grace spoke about the future, about her hopes for their ranch and their family, about the life she wanted to build with Martin. He shared his own dreams, and together they wove a vision of what might be, grounded in the reality of hard work and scarce resources, but lifted by hope and love. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they stood together on their porch wrapped in a shared blanket against the cold, watching the new day arrive. "Another dawn," Martin said softly. "Another darkness survived, another day of light to come." "Another dawn," Grace agreed, leaning into his warmth. "And I think this one brings more peace than fear." Spring came to the Mojave with an explosion of wildflowers that transformed the desert into a carpet of gold and purple and pink. The seasonal rains had been generous that year, and the landscape responded with life that seemed impossible given the harsh conditions of summer. Grace's garden flourished, and their 2 cows both gave birth to healthy calves, doubling their small herd and filling Grace with pride at their growing success. The nightmares had become rare by then, perhaps once or twice a month, and even those were gentler than before, more melancholy than terrifying. Grace no longer dreaded sleep, no longer lay awake anticipating horrors. She slept curled against Martin's side, secure in his presence and in the life they had built together. One warm April evening, as they worked together in the garden pulling weeds and checking the vegetables, Grace straightened and pressed a hand to her stomach with a thoughtful expression. Martin noticed immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern coloring his voice. "I am fine," Grace assured him, then smiled slowly. "Actually, I am better than fine. Martin, I think I might be pregnant." Martin dropped the hoe he had been using and crossed to her in 3 long strides, his face alight with joy and wonder. "Truly, are you certain?" "Not completely certain," Grace admitted, "but fairly sure." My courses are late, and I have been feeling queasy in the mornings, and there are other signs. I thought perhaps we could ride into town on Sunday, and I could speak with Dr. Hart to confirm it." Martin picked her up and spun her in a circle, laughing with delight, then immediately set her down carefully as though she might break. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with awe. "We are going to have a baby." Grace felt happiness bubble up inside her like the spring water that fed their land. A year ago she had been trapped in Boston, suffocated by guilt and nightmares, unable to imagine any future beyond gray endurance. Now she stood in the desert sunset with a husband she loved and the promise of a child growing inside her, and life seemed full of possibility rather than limitation. Dr. Hart confirmed the pregnancy the following Sunday, estimating that the baby would arrive in late October or early November. He pronounced Grace healthy and gave her practical advice about diet and rest, warning her about the challenges of pregnancy in the desert heat, but expressing confidence in her strength. Eleanor Patterson was thrilled by the news and immediately began organizing the women of Randsburg to help prepare baby clothes and supplies. As Grace's pregnancy progressed through the blazing summer months, Martin became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from doing any work that he deemed too strenuous. Grace tolerated his concern with good humor, knowing it came from love, but she also insisted on maintaining her normal activities as much as possible. She was pregnant, she reminded him, not an invalid. The nightmares stopped entirely in her second trimester, as though her mind had finally released its grip on past trauma to focus on future possibilities. Grace mentioned this to Martin one evening as they sat together with his hand resting on her swelling belly, feeling the baby kick and roll. "I have not had a nightmare in over a month," she said wonderingly. "I did not even notice until just now. They just gradually faded away. Perhaps you needed to exorcise your demons before you could welcome new life," Martin suggested. "Or perhaps you simply needed to learn that you were strong enough to survive the darkness, and once you learned that lesson, the nightmares were no longer necessary." "Whatever the reason, I am grateful," Grace said, covering his hand with hers. "And I am grateful to you, Martin. You kept your promise. You stayed with me through every nightmare, held me through every fear, and helped me find my way to dawn and peace. I would not have made it here without you." "We made it together," Martin corrected. "You did the hard work of healing, Grace. I just provided a safe place for you to do that work." Their son was born on a cool November evening with Dr. Hart attending and Eleanor Patterson serving as midwife. The labor was long and difficult, but Grace bore it with the same strength she had shown in facing her nightmares, and when Martin finally held their son in his arms, there were tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Martin whispered, staring down at the tiny, red-faced infant with wonder. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Matthew Vance, and he proved to be a generally content baby, nursing well and sleeping for reasonable stretches. Grace sometimes woke in the night to feed him, but there were no nightmares, only the sweet tiredness of new motherhood and the joy of watching her son grow and thrive. The years that followed brought the normal challenges and triumphs of ranch life. Their small herd grew slowly but steadily. Martin's reputation as a skilled cattleman earned him opportunities to buy good stock at fair prices. Grace's garden expanded, and she began selling vegetables and eggs in Randsburg, bringing in extra income that helped them build onto their house. They added a separate bedroom and a proper kitchen, then later a second bedroom when Grace discovered she was pregnant again. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1890, a tiny girl with Grace's green eyes and Martin's determined chin. They named her Georgia, and she was as spirited as her brother Matthew was placid. 2 years later came another son, Mitchell, who seemed to combine the best traits of both his siblings. Through pregnancies and childbirths, through seasons of plenty and seasons of scarcity, through the normal joys and sorrows of life, Martin kept his promise to Grace. Whenever darkness threatened, whether external or internal, he was there as her shelter and support. And Grace discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, capable of building a life she could never have dreamed of during those dark years in Boston. On their 10th wedding anniversary in August of 1897, Martin and Grace sat together on their porch in the evening coolness, watching their 3 children play in the yard. Matthew was nearly 9 years old, tall and lean like his father, with a gift for working with animals. Georgia was 7, bright and curious, with a love of books that Grace encouraged by teaching her to read far beyond what the sporadic school terms in Randsburg provided. Mitchell was 5, charming and energetic, keeping them all on their toes with his adventures. "You ever think about Boston?" Martin asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed?" Grace considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I wonder if my mother is still alive, if she ever regretted the things she said to me. I wonder what happened to our house, to my father's business, to the few friends I had before the scandal. But I do not think about it with longing or regret. That life feels like it belonged to someone else, someone I used to be." "You still have nightmares?" Martin asked, though he knew the answer. They had discussed this before, marking the passage of time by the absence of what had once been an every-night occurrence. "Not in years," Grace said. "The last one I remember was before Mitchell was born, and even that was more of an unsettling dream than a true nightmare. I think I finally finished working through the grief and guilt. Or perhaps I simply replaced those old memories with so many new, better ones that the darkness no longer has any power over me." "I think you are the bravest person I have ever known," Martin said quietly. "You faced your demons, Grace. You did the hard work of healing, of choosing life and hope over despair, and look at what you have built." He gestured toward their children, their home, their land. "This is your triumph, every bit of it." Grace turned to kiss him, still feeling the flutter of love that had never dimmed despite the passing years and the inevitable routines of married life. "Our triumph," she corrected. "I could never have built this alone. You gave me the safety and support I needed to heal. You held me through the nightmares until dawn brought peace, over and over again, never giving up on me even when I had given up on myself." "I loved you," Martin said simply. "And love does not give up." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in glorious shades of crimson and gold, Grace thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had left Boston a broken woman, fleeing trauma and seeking escape. She had arrived in Randsburg afraid and alone, hiding her wounds behind false smiles and careful lies. But Martin had seen through her masks, had refused to let her suffer in silence, had literally held her through the darkness until the light returned. Together they had built something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. Not quickly or easily, but with patience and love and the determination to face each challenge as it came. The nightmares that had once seemed insurmountable had eventually faded, not because they were ignored or suppressed, but because they were acknowledged, spoken aloud, and robbed of their power through the simple act of sharing the burden. Grace had learned that healing was not a destination but a journey. That strength came not from never falling but from always getting back up. And that love properly given could transform even the deepest wounds into scars that no longer ached. She had learned that dawn always followed darkness, that peace could be found even after terrible trauma, and that the future did not have to be limited by the past. Matthew came running up to the porch then, breathless with excitement, reporting that he had seen a family of quail in the brush near the spring. Georgia and Mitchell followed close behind, arguing about whose turn it was to feed the chickens in the morning. Martin stood to settle the dispute with the wisdom of Solomon, and Grace watched her family with a heart so full it felt like it might overflow. This was her life now. Not the one she had imagined as a girl in Boston, not the future her parents had planned for her, but something entirely her own, built from courage and love and the determination to survive. The nightmares that had once defined her existence were now just distant memories, ghosts that no longer haunted her waking or sleeping hours. The desert sunset faded slowly, darkness creeping across the land, but Grace felt no fear. She knew that Martin would be beside her through the night, that their children slept safely under their roof, that morning would come with all its promise and possibility. She had learned to trust in the cycle of darkness and light, to understand that both were necessary, and that survival meant not avoiding the dark but having someone to hold you through it until the dawn arrived. And dawn always arrived, bringing with it the peace she had sought for so long and finally found here in the desert, in the arms of a cowboy who had kept his promise, in the life they had built together from hope and hard work and healing. Years continued to pass in their gentle rhythm. The ranch prospered as Martin's hard work and Grace's careful management paid dividends. Their cattle herd grew to a size that allowed them to be more selective about the stock they kept, improving quality and reputation. Grace's vegetable sales expanded to include preserved goods, jams and pickles that the mining families eagerly purchased. They paid off the last of their debts and began saving money toward buying more land. Matthew grew into a capable young man who shared his father's gift with cattle and horses. By the time he was 15 in 1896, he was working alongside Martin as a full partner in the ranch operations, his judgment trusted and his contributions valued. Georgia continued her education voraciously, corresponding with a teacher in Los Angeles who sent her books and assignments, determined that her daughter would have opportunities she herself had been denied. Mitchell showed an aptitude for mechanics and engineering that surprised everyone, able to repair or improve anything mechanical, and fascinated by the new technologies beginning to filter even into remote places like Randsburg. In 1898, Grace received a letter forwarded through several addresses, a lawyer in Boston tracking her down to inform her that her mother had passed away the previous winter. There was no inheritance, the lawyer explained, as the remaining funds had been used for her mother's care in her final illness. But the lawyer wanted Grace to know that her mother had expressed regret in her final days, had asked the lawyer to find Grace and tell her that she had been wrong to blame her daughter, that grief had made her cruel when she should have been comforting. Grace read the letter alone in her kitchen, tears sliding down her cheeks as she processed this final message from a woman she had not seen or spoken to in over a decade. The old pain was still there, but it was distant now, softened by time and by the life she had built. She grieved for her mother, for the relationship they had never been able to repair, but she also felt a kind of closure, a final releasing of old burdens. When Martin came home that evening, Grace showed him the letter and let him hold her while she cried for what had been lost and what could never be recovered. But she also told him that she was grateful for where life had led her, that she would not change the path that had brought her to Randsburg and to him, even knowing the pain that had been part of the journey. "Every experience shapes us," she said as they sat together in their bedroom, the house quiet around them with the children long asleep. "Even the terrible ones, even the ones we would never choose. I am who I am because of everything that happened, including the nightmares and the darkness. And I like who I have become. I am proud of who we have become together." Martin kissed her forehead tenderly. "Your mother was wrong about you," he said. "You are neither selfish nor shameful. You are brave and strong and compassionate. You took your pain and turned it into purpose, built a life worth living from ashes and ruins. That takes a kind of courage most people never have to find." The new century arrived with celebration in Randsburg, the small town gathering to mark the turn from 1899 to 1900, with fireworks and speeches and general optimism about the future. Grace and Martin attended with their children, now ranging from 12-year-old Mitchell to nearly 18-year-old Matthew, who had recently begun courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, much to his parents' amusement and approval. Standing in the town square with Martin's arm around her and her children around them both, Grace thought about how far she had come from that terrified young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 13 years earlier. She had been running from pain then, seeking escape rather than solution. But she had found instead a place to stand and fight, a partner to stand beside her in that fight, and the strength within herself that she had not known existed. The nightmares were gone completely now, so long absent that she sometimes forgot she had ever suffered from them. The guilt over her father's death had transformed into a more mature understanding of his choices and her own innocence in them. She still felt sad when she thought about him, still wished things could have been different, but she no longer carried the crushing weight of false responsibility. In 1902, Matthew married his sweetheart Rebecca Morrison, daughter of Martin's former employer Jacob Morrison, and brought her to live on the ranch in a small house they built on the far end of the property. Grace welcomed her daughter-in-law warmly, remembering her own arrival as a bride in this harsh landscape, and did her best to make Rebecca feel supported and valued. Georgia announced in 1903 that she intended to become a teacher, a declaration that surprised no one who knew her love of learning. She took a position at the school in Randsburg, boarding with Mrs. Chen during the week and returning home on weekends, bringing with her stories of her students and the challenges of teaching in a mining town where families came and went with the whims of mineral discovery. Mitchell, showing his mechanical aptitude, apprenticed with a man in Los Angeles who worked on the new horseless carriages beginning to appear, though he came home frequently, unable to fully leave the desert that had shaped him. In 1905, on a warm spring evening much like the one where they had first confessed their love 18 years earlier, Grace and Martin sat together on their porch watching the sunset. They were in their early 40s now, both showing the wear of years spent in the desert sun and the hard work of ranch life, but still strong and healthy and deeply in love. "You ever regret answering my advertisement?" Martin asked, a question he had posed variations of over the years, always seeking reassurance that Grace had found happiness in the life they had built. Grace smiled and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long familiarity. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once in 20 years have I regretted the decision to come to Randsburg and marry you. You saved my life, Martin, not in some dramatic fashion with physical danger, but in a deeper, more important way. You saw me when I was broken and convinced me I could be whole again. You held me through the nightmares until dawn brought peace, over and over, until I learned to find peace on my own. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. How could I ever regret that?" "I am the one who should be grateful," Martin insisted. "You brought intelligence and strength and beauty into my life when I was just a lonely cowboy with more dreams than prospects. You helped me build something real and lasting. You gave me children I am proud of, and a partnership that has sustained me through every challenge. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Their lives had not been without difficulties. There had been droughts and financial struggles, illnesses and injuries, conflicts and misunderstandings. But through all of it, they had maintained the foundation they had built in those early days when Martin had held Grace through her nightmares and showed her that darkness was not permanent, that dawn would always come if you could just survive through the night. Grace thought about the woman she had been at 22, arriving in Randsburg with her heart full of fear and her nights full of terror. She thought about the long journey from trauma to healing, from isolation to connection, from despair to hope. It had not been a quick or easy path, but it had been worth every difficult step. The nightmares that had once dominated her life were now just part of her history. Evidence of pain survived rather than prison walls confining her. She had learned that healing was possible, that love could transform wounds into wisdom, and that the human spirit was far more resilient than she had ever imagined. As Martin's grandchildren began arriving, first Matthew and Rebecca's son in 1903, and then their daughter in 1905, Grace discovered new dimensions to joy and purpose. Holding her grandson for the first time, seeing her own features reflected in this tiny new life, she felt the final pieces of her old pain dissolve. The future stretched ahead full of possibility, new generations to love and guide, new chapters to write in the ongoing story of their family. In 1907, on their 20th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Matthew and Rebecca brought their children. Georgia came from town with her new fiancé, a lawyer who had recently moved to Randsburg and been utterly charmed by the intelligent, passionate teacher. Mitchell arrived from Los Angeles with stories of the new technologies he was working with and promises to bring one of the horseless carriages to visit soon so everyone could see this marvel of modern engineering. Friends from town attended as well. Eleanor and Thomas Patterson still running the general store after all these years. Dr. Hart now semi-retired but still available for emergencies. Mrs. Chen older but still sharp-eyed and managing her boarding house with quiet efficiency. These people had become Grace's family over the past 20 years, supporting her through challenges and celebrating her triumphs, and she loved them all. As the party wound down and the guests departed, Grace and Martin found themselves alone on their porch once more, the familiar position they had occupied through countless evenings of their marriage. The desert night was clear and cool, perfect in the way that only desert nights could be, and Grace felt profoundly content. 20 years, Martin mused. It seems both very long and very short at the same time. So much has happened, so much has changed, yet in some ways it feels like just yesterday that I was nervously waiting in Mrs. Chen's parlor for you to come downstairs. I was terrified, Grace admitted with a laugh. Convinced you would take one look at me and realize you had made a terrible mistake. I had traveled so far on such faith, trusting that a man I had never met would somehow be my salvation. And was I? Martin asked, turning to look at her directly. Your salvation, I mean. Grace considered the question seriously, knowing Martin deserved an honest answer. No, she said finally. You were not my salvation because I had to save myself, but you were the safe harbor where I could dock while doing the work of saving myself. You were the steady presence that allowed me to face my demons rather than continue running from them. You were the love that convinced me I was worth saving. So not salvation, perhaps, but something equally important. You were my partner in the journey from darkness to light. Martin pulled her close, kissing her with the tenderness that had never diminished despite 2 decades of marriage. I think that might be the most beautiful thing you have ever said to me, he murmured against her hair, "and I have been blessed by every day of this journey with you." They sat together long into the night, talking about the past and the future, about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and their plans for the coming years. They spoke of small things and large ones, of daily concerns and existential questions, with the easy intimacy of two people who had shared a life and built something meaningful from their joining. When they finally went to bed in the early hours of morning, Grace settled into Martin's arms with the familiar comfort of countless nights before. She closed her eyes and drifted toward sleep without fear, without anticipation of nightmares, without anything but peaceful tiredness and the security of knowing she was loved and safe. The nightmares had ended years ago, replaced by the ordinary dreams of ordinary life. But Grace never forgot the darkness she had survived or the man who had held her through it. Those nights when Martin had refused to let her face her terrors alone had taught her the true meaning of partnership and love, had shown her that strength sometimes meant accepting help rather than insisting on facing everything alone. As she drifted into sleep, Grace's last conscious thought was of gratitude for the life she had built, for the family that surrounded her, for the love that sustained her, and for the dawn that always followed darkness, bringing with it the peace she had sought for so long and finally found in the arms of a cowboy in the wild desert of California, 20 years and a lifetime ago. The years continued to unfold in their steady progression, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that were part of any life fully lived. Martin and Grace grew older together, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and harsh climate, but their love remaining strong and vital. They watched their children build their own lives and families, took pride in their grandchildren, and continued working the ranch that had been the foundation of everything they had built. In 1912, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with another gathering of family and friends, this time with 4 grandchildren running around the property and Georgia pregnant with her first child. Martin had some gray in his hair now, and Grace's face showed lines earned by years of sun and laughter. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young man and woman who had stood nervously in Mrs. Chen's parlor a quarter-century earlier, hoping they had made the right choice in marrying a stranger. "We did all right," Martin said that evening as they surveyed their gathered family. "Turned out pretty well, considering we started with nothing but hope and determination." "We had more than that," Grace corrected gently. "We had each other and we had the willingness to face hard things together. That was always enough." As the sun set over the desert one more time, painting the familiar landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Grace thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the nightmares that had once controlled her life to the peace she had found through love and perseverance, from the broken girl who had fled Boston to the strong woman who had built a legacy in the California desert. She had traveled so far. The cowboy who had held her through those early nightmares stood beside her still, his promise kept through 25 years of marriage and all the challenges that had entailed. Together, they had proven that dawn always followed darkness, that peace could be found even after terrible trauma, and that love given freely and sustained through difficulty could transform everything.